education. And as you can see, I have highlighted in yellow all of these outcomes that relate directly to borrowing or lending. We see delinquency rates fall. We see credit scores improve. We see student borrowing shifting from high to low cost methods, which could be from private loans to public loans, for example. High cost borrowing, for example, payday loan usage declines. And we also increase student loan repayment frequency, particularly for first generation students attending public school. And our subjective financial well-being also improves. And we show that these effects are biggest for students from our low-income families, which is amazing. A look at how many of these can be affected by sharing information about borrowing and lending. I think it just really shows that we have a lot of opportunity within this particular domain to really make impactful change, especially in the borrowing and lending habits of ourselves and our students. But we know that when it comes to anything that's great for students, it begins and ends with educators, right? And so the purpose behind this professional development series is really to help educators feel more confident in the material, in the content, in the standards, and in different ways that it can be implemented into the classroom so that you feel that self-efficacy is high and you're ready to start bringing this into your students. And for our last little introduction piece, I would just like to introduce myself briefly. Hello, my name is Amy Cleaver. I am the Elementary Program Supervisor for the Financial Education Public-Private Partnership. And this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I am not sitting here presenting to you as somebody who has all of the answers to these questions. I am here as somebody who really could have used this professional development when I was an educator. I worked in both 5th grade and 7th grade classrooms, and I knew personal finance instruction was really important to my students, particularly because I taught in a low socioeconomic status neighborhood with 96% of our students qualifying for free or reduced lunch. However, 3 years into my teaching career, I also had over $15,000 in credit card debt, consumer credit card debt. And this is not big purchases. I was not financing a college education on my credit card. This was nickel and dime everyday stuff that I had snowballed into what felt like an insurmountable amount. Through a classroom economy program I developed for my 5th and 7th grade students and refining that program throughout the 10 years of my teaching career, that was really my push that empowered myself to learn about personal finance. I say that because I was doing it for my students, it kind of pushed me through the discomfort of not knowing and gave me kind of the nudge I needed to start really investing in my human capital and learning more about this. So I consider myself a financial wellness work in progress. We're going to talk about financial wellness a lot over the course of this series. And to me, that's the ultimate goal, that our personal finances are a slice of the pie that compose our wellness, but it's not the whole pie and it's not affecting a bunch of other slices. Financial wellness just recognizes that our money matters affect our overall physical, mental, emotional, social health. And that by putting some effort into or some time into digging into where some of our issues come from, and we're going to talk about that when we come with financial trauma, that can give us different perspectives and allow us to hold space for people who had really different experiences than us, whether that be fellow educators, people in our family, or students. And I would like to say welcome and thank you to our guest speakers today. We have with us Tierra Bonds, who is the CEO of Take Charge Credit Consulting, LLC from Seattle, Washington. And Tierra, are you able to come on and say hi?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm
Awesome.
so happy to be here. Thank you, Amy.
Would you like to tell us just a little bit about yourself and Take Charge Credit Consulting?
Absolutely. First, thank you, Amy, for inviting me to be a part of this and for everyone for showing up with the beautiful weather that we have outside. It just shows your dedication and passion. So I started Take Charge Consulting 7 years ago, and similarly to Amy, it was out of personal experience with you know, I don't know if that was your experience, Amy, but just not understanding credit, not understanding personal credit, getting myself into some trouble, experiencing a lot of shame and guilt and embarrassment, and then deciding to learn about it, really to be the resource in my network, starting with myself, and then helped family and friends, and then it's since expanded to helping individuals all over the country. And I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Amy. You're on mute, Amy.
You're on mute.
I was on mute and it's going everywhere. I am so sorry here, guys. Oh, I hate it when this happens, and I apologize sincerely and thank you for your grace. Tim.
I thought you were trying to mute me.
I would never. Tim Rhoades.
My name is Tim Rhoades.
Elementary educator.
Oh, go ahead.
I would say elementary educator with North Shore School District in Bothell, Washington for 40 years. Is that correct?
Yeah.
He is also
like
one
10.
of our FEPPP Fellows, one of our FEPPP Fellows, which is our peer-to-peer instructional network. And if anyone will join me in a quick round of applause, Tim actually retired this year as well, which we congratulate you for, sir. Well deserved. Please take it away if you'd like to introduce yourself and share your, if you wouldn't mind sharing the story of how you got into personal.
It's funny. Amy's just talking about this, and so is Tara. Most of us, the finance comes from mistakes. It doesn't come from making smart. And I can say that with 50 or 60 years experience, that my first experience with finance actually came when I was about 12 years old. I grew up down in Puyallup, down kind of south of Seattle. And we went to a farmer's, it was a farm auction for animals. And unbeknownst to me, I was moving my hand and scratching my ear, and my dad had to buy 4 chickens. Because I just sort of did this and didn't realize and that was my first introduction to finance, and realizing there's unintended consequences sometimes to things you do. And it was funny because that planted a seed. And I just grew up in a family where we were kind of like natural consequences. And in my teaching, finance just became a natural evolution of trying to find ways to make learning engaging and impactful. And to this day, I firmly believe that if you're looking for somebody who's an expert, none of us are experts. We're all in this process, and sometimes I think almost everybody's made mistakes, and hopefully we've kind of learned from them. And my goal as an elementary teacher has always been to help impact students by planting some seeds and making finance not be this mysterious abstract concept, but something you do every single day, whenever you can, almost like you live and breathe it. And that finance has been my passion for, 40 years at least, teaching for sure.
I love that. And it makes me kind of want to pose our first question to the audience. So if you guys wouldn't mind engaging with the chat, I would love to know, what kind of personal finance instruction did you get in your school experience? Did you receive any? And specifically, what did you learn about credit cards? If it's easier and you prefer to, just give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down, you can do that as well for participation. But I would love to know, we're talking about mistakes, we're talking about how we all just kind of learned trial by fire. I'm curious if anyone here really feels like they got a different experience than that. So as we are giving you some time to kind of fill in that chat and see what people have to say, we're going to move on to our first section, and we're going to talk about trauma, financial trauma, and the trauma of debt. This slide comes from the Trauma of Money, which is a curriculum program. I have borrowed it from an OESTA training, and it just notes that trauma can be a single experience, it can be ongoing, it can be inherited, or it can be from our time in the womb as epigenetics. And before I move on, I have to come back to the chat because there's 24 comments in the chat. So we have to come back. Let's see, we've got everything, a lot of trial by fires. I see it. Being taught to sign a check or what do we call it? Checkbook register, fill out a checkbook register. Looks like someone, oh, Heather got it in freshman and senior year. That's amazing. Bookkeeping, but not credits.
Yeah.
Nice. One man from a car dealership came to talk about finance for formal education in 12th. That's nice. A lot of people are picking it up from their parents. I think that's so normal. And I have one more very specific question. Did anyone else get their first credit card on a college campus, or was that just my experience? My first credit card, I want to say Wells Fargo had signed up with Domino's Pizzas at the entrance to my college campus. And I signed up for a card to get a pizza with very little information on how that whole thing was. Yep. Okay. So we got quite a few people. You know, what's awesome is that I'm seeing a lot of people mention home and the role of home in this information as well. And I think that's so great because that's definitely something we want to talk about when it comes to trauma as well. So I would love to, let's see here, move on. So as a working definition, we'll talk about financial trauma as a mind-body response to a highly stressful event impacting our financial well-being that we have difficulty recovering from. And you see here some examples of financial trauma. And I think growing up in a low socioeconomic status household or having very little socioeconomic power is probably the definition of financial trauma that is the most common in people's mind. But I really think we can extend that to recognize that trauma happens, trauma extends beyond just economic hardship. I would also like to note that some people will differentiate between big T trauma and little t trauma, if you're familiar with those terms before. But I recently came across the term trauma competition, and I kind of liked that. So in this context, we're going to look at all trauma as inherently with the same value, nothing higher or lower. And then in our first session, if you were here, one of our guest speakers, Jennifer Ness Frankie, shared an experience about personal experience about a romantic partner that exercised a lot of control and abuse over finances. But I would also like to share my personal example with financial trauma that has to do with financial abuse and control in a different context. And hopefully this will put things in like somewhat perspective. So my family, I am half Japanese on my mother's side. My grandmother's entire family was interned during World War II. They were in Minidoka. During that time, if you're familiar with the historical atrocities, so the Japanese people that were taken to internment camps lost all property, any ownership of anything, whether it was land, houses, businesses, those were all taken upon entering the camp, and they were not returned upon exiting the camp. So at about the age of 18, right about ready to graduate from high school, this was my grandmother's experience. That financial trauma in her personal life obviously had an effect on how she viewed money, her relationship with money, her relationship with saving and spending. But you can see how it could also impact a person's sense of safety. This was a generational trauma, right? Their willingness to change careers or do anything that could risk income, right? Their ability to trust others with money manners. And what we see most often with financial trauma is an inability or a struggle to plan for a future, because that future could change quite quickly, or in this context, be taken away. And so when we say financial trauma-informed financial education, I'm going to go back 2 slides now. When we're looking at financial education through this trauma-informed lens, we're recognizing really the context of a person's situation and kind of keying in on this quote on the lower left hand from the Prosperity Now financial coaching design program. This mindset before with financial education has kind of been, well, if people just knew, if they just had this knowledge, if we just told them to make these habits and we just gave them this content, then everything would be fine and people would know what to do and they could, experience economic mobility or start building generational wealth. And what we're really noticing now is that because of the impacts of these financial trauma, we have to look at situations with the entire context, all the different colors of a person's life and background, before we can really look at steps for being able to affect these positive changes. So that was just a little part I wanted to share about the idea of what this trauma-informed lens really looks like when we're applying it to financial education. And as I move forward here, and another way that we can look at financial trauma within historical context is by looking at the racial wealth, pay, and credit gaps. And because today we're talking about credit, we are going to focus on the racial credit gap today. And what you see in front of you is a report that just notes the differences in credit scores among young adults by age and racial and ethnic community composition. So these are for majority Black and Hispanic communities. And you'll see that not only do they have lower median credit scores than their white peers, but those scores are going down over time. And this shows between the age of 18 and 29. So these are the years when a youth is beginning to be, entering the job force and earning income. And so when they're faced with these sort of barriers from the jump, it can be very discouraging. So I would love to invite Tierra now to speak a little bit about the racial credit gap, as this is an area that she is very passionate about and has committed time to addressing.
Thank you, Amy. Thank
Absolutely.
you. Very passionate about the racial wealth gap. And I love how you point out the racial credit gaps, because the one thing that I learned is we can't address the racial wealth gap if we're not addressing the racial credit gap. And so when Amy showed me this the other day, I noticed that the scores kept getting lower for Black and Hispanics, compared to the whites' credit scores kept getting higher as they got older. So that's what I pointed out from this. And then on the next slide, it reminded me, oh, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you. I apologize.
Yes.
Just for one moment, because I forgot to, again, my notes aren't showing up. So I forgot this one part that I want to make sure is important. Yeah. 1.1 million students in Washington schools. If you add up the percentage of our students who are Black, who identify as majority Hispanic or Latino of any race, who identify as two or more races, or who identify as American, Indian, or Alaskan Native, who are absolutely affected by the racial credit gap, but heavily underreported in that area. You get over 45% of our students who are going to experience this racial credit gap. And to be honest, the majority of our teachers in Washington are white. So they may not have had this experience. They may not share this lived experience, but it's important for us to be able to recognize it so that we can prepare our students and set them up for success as they encounter this in the future. So thank you so much, Tierra, for letting me interrupt you, and I'll go ahead and move on to your next slide.
Thank you. That's very important to note. Also, the people that are not even calculated into those numbers with no credit scores. So very, very important. But when Amy showed me that, it reminded me of an article that I wrote for the Seattle Emerald, where I included this example showing the differences in credit scores and what that does to a person's ability to build wealth. And so I compared two credit scores, 734, which was the average credit score for a white person, and then 677, which was the average credit score for a Black person. And I reached out to one of my favorite real estate agents and asked, what is the average price of a home right now in South Seattle? And this was in 2022 and in January. So things are much different now, but at that time it was 625,000. And then I reached out to one of my favorite lenders, and gave her these two different credit scores and really wanted to paint the picture of what that looked like when buying a home. My organization focuses on building credit. Sorry about that. Focuses on building credit, and I have a lot of people that go through the program and they're starting in the 500s, low 600s, and so to get them up to a 670 or a 680, 690 is a huge success. However, my goal is always to get them up to, at least a 730 so that when they're buying a home, they're getting the best deal. So I wanted to kind of paint this picture so that we could really see what it looks like. Again, this was 2022, so interest rates are not 3.5 or 4.1 anymore, but giving the lender the two credit scores, the same exact home, so same price, same zip code. I asked her what the difference in interest rates would be, and ultimately what that would look like over the life of the loan. And so the lower credit score would have got a 4.1 interest rate, and the higher credit score would have got a 3.5. And this is also assuming income and everything else is the same. The only thing that was different was the credit scores. So I'm curious what you all think, if we can get some engagement in the chat, what you think the overall interest, the additional interest that the lower credit score paid.
We have
And
any
if
math people in here.
yeah.
And while people are taking a look at that, if people are interested in typing, we had kind of a question that I think is important to circle back to. So when we're looking at that last chart, we're looking at these differences with the average credit score for white person, average credit score for Black person. And the question was, is that because of excessive use of credit or because of a cash dominant culture?
That's a really good question.
Isn't that a great question?
Yeah. From my experience, William, the individuals that I help, which I would say 85% are people from, lower socioeconomic backgrounds. They are absolutely terrified of credit cards. So the bigger issue on their the most common issue on their credit report are collections. So things going into collections, not being able to pay their um, cell phone bill and it gets closed, or their utility bill and it gets closed and goes to their credit report, most commonly medical bills. And really just not having the income to support those versus people just having excessive credit card debt. I would say those are the two different types of clients I get, but most of them are in that area of they don't even have credit cards. So part of our plan is, as you probably all know, is we have to have credit cards on our credit report to have some a decent score. So most of the rebuilding plan is getting those negative accounts removed, but then also adding positive credit cards to their credit card or to their credit reports and teaching them how to use them responsibly and addressing that trauma around, many people being told their first introduction to a credit card was it's scary, don't touch it, leave it alone. And so kind of getting people past that and addressing that trauma so that they're able to leverage credit and then use it responsibly. So I think it is more of a cash dominant culture, but not, it's very rare that people coming to me from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have excessive credit card debt.
Awesome. Thank you so much for addressing that. And that was a great question. Thank you. Well, okay, so let's go ahead. We had one guess over 300,000. So let's go ahead and see. Oof.
Yes.
Oof.
Thank goodness it's not 300,000.
Thank goodness.
But the additional interest that they would pay in 1 year is about 2,500. And then over the life of the loan, let's say they didn't refi during those 30 years, it would be about 76,000. Again, this was 2022. Interest rates are about double right now. So we are looking more close to that 300,000, Rebecca. So that's a very good guess.
I would have loved to lock in at these interest rates. My timing was not this good. All right, well, thank you so much, Tierra, for kind of addressing that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about racial discrimination in resources for that, if that is something that would be relevant to your, sorry, not you, Tierra, but you, participant, to your student experience as well. So now it's my turn to talk a little bit about some of this content knowledge, right? About the standards. If someone says, hey, I would love for you to teach some credit and debt this year. I need to do some financial education. Let's talk about credit cards. What exactly does that mean? We have state standards, but let's make them easier. I'm going to show you what I call a deconstruction of these state standards. Briefly, these 6 items here on the right are our financial education competencies that progress through K-12 for Washington State. I call it the Jeopardy board of things we all wish we had learned in high school. Today, we are focusing on credit and debt, although our future sessions for this webinar will talk about taxes for employment and income, investing, we'll talk about getting banked for insurance and risk management, and for financial decision-making, we'll talk about scams and frauds. As today we're talking about credit and debt, we are going to focus on just one of these substandards. There's so much content in here. And so let's just look at the first substandard, which is analyze the costs and benefits of various types of credit. And I hope, let's put a pin in this, but if you agree with me, if we had all gotten this, just this one standard, how different our financial outlook might have been. Let's start with our foundational knowledge. And if you were in the last session, you'll know I am going to call this foundational knowledge, even though you will find these in the elementary standards. That is part of our trauma-informed approach. Some people, some of our students, some of us did not grow up in environments or homes where any of this knowledge was shared. So if this is where your students are starting, this is where we start. And it doesn't do them any good to label that elementary knowledge. So let's just call it foundational, right? We need them to know that borrowing is different than buying, and that the rules for using and returning borrowed items, including money, are different than things that we own. And we really want them to know that there are advantages and disadvantages to borrowing. Borrowing in general, but borrowing money in that same context. Overspending can lead to borrowing problems. And you can see this a lot play out within elementary social engagement as well, I think. So it's not too far out for them. And then we're introducing the idea of the credit card, that it is a form of borrowing, that you can purchase something today and pay for it in the future. So again, really foundational. And I would really encourage, when we get to this part, to look at the social and emotional aspects of borrowing and lending with our young learners, and really with our intermediate learners as well. But this is sort of where we want to start laying the stage for understanding the credit system in America. Intermediately, or if you're thinking in grade levels, when they move into middle school, this is when they get introduced to more specifics of a loan or borrowing. So the idea of the interest rate, the loan balance, and that loan term, and how those 3 triangulate to affect that total cost of borrowing, this is intermediate and we're building up to it. One way to build up to it is to recognize and establish the difference between debit cards and credit cards. So using that compare and contrast can be a great way for students to understand the difference between what happens when I swipe this and what happens when I swipe this. And can also be a great opportunity to throw out some scenarios to them and say, hey, should I have used credit or debit on this? I need a $200 pair of sneakers. I have $150 in the bank. Should I use the credit card for the whole 200? Should I use the 150 in the bank and just put 50 on the credit card? You know, because we want them to understand, and again, you see this in red, that there is a total cost of borrowing, that what you borrow is only what you pay back if you follow a very specific set of circumstances. The math starts mathing in this in this intermediate knowledge because the middle school math standards, if you teach middle school math, you know that they connect so much to this learning. So there's an amazing opportunity within middle school math to really dig into some personal finance. I am getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. So please let me know if you are unable to hear me. So again, so the total cost of borrowing, recognizing that you end up paying more in some circumstances, that's where we get this skill of calculating the total cost of a loan. Again, this is folded in with math standards. On this intermediate area, we're also introducing the idea of easy access credit. This is like predatory lending. This is like the check cashing places. It's important to mention these because they literally prey on our most vulnerable citizens of all ages. And then one of the best things that we can do for ourselves and our students is to help them find alternative pathways to not involve easy access credit. And we're also introducing this concept that debt can be considered an investment. And this is, this ties back to what Tierra said, and this is definitely a conversation to have, right? So many kids, I don't know if you guys hear it, I hear it, I'm never getting a credit card. I'm never putting anything on credit. But in reality, can we be successful in our American financial system without credit, right? We can't have a credit score of 0 and make moves that will build generational wealth. Consider it an investment. I think the easiest example there is that a student loan or to do some sort of post-secondary training or education that invests in your human capital, your income earning potential, and it pays out for you in the future. We want to make sure that that is intertwined into this knowledge about debt so they recognize that it is in some ways very necessary. By the time we get to the 3rd level, high school, we're looking at more skill development, right? So what would we love in an ideal world? This foundation has been laid when they were younger learners, they've built upon it. And by the time they escape or set out to the real world, they have a set of skills. Again, it's worth repeating. The total cost of borrowing is something they understand, but at this level, we're also talking about things like grace periods, fees, introductory offers, and things like that. We're also looking at 3 major skills here, which are dictated in the standards that I think are the most important and relevant. Comparing the cost of borrowing $1,000 with different consumer credit options, right? If you were to put it onto a credit card, if you were to take out a personal loan, even if you were to borrow it from a friend or from a paycheck cashing place. Second skill would be looking at the total cost of reducing a credit card balance to 0 with minimum payments versus above minimum payments. And really, that's all we're focusing on with this one, minimum versus above minimum, and having them understand the power of making those above minimum payments. And as a secondary thing, having them understand that the bank is giving you the minimum payments on the bill because they want you to take your time so they can make the money off the interest. Underlining all of this is some knowledge that we kind of maybe assume in sometimes of their hearts. Kind of like how Instagram exists just so people can connect, right? No, like social media exists to make money. It is a money-making machine. And banks, not credit unions, but banks also exist to make money. And the way they make money is by people borrowing it. So we can't always trust what it says on the statement. We got to empower ourselves to know that they're only going to tell me the minimum payment because that keeps me in their pocket for longer. I might have to do the math with my knowledge to see what I have to pay to get it paid off in time. And then that last skill would be deciding the most cost-effective loan options for a major purchase such as a car. This is where we're going to use as the jumping off point for next week's session, just so you know. Today, we're looking at sort of the basics of credit. Next week, we will look more at specifically using credit to finance a vehicle, and we'll dig a lot more into credit scores on that session. And we'll give you some resources as well on how to read and look up your credit score and how your students can do that as well, just so you know. If I were to put onto a visual roadmap, because I'm a visual kind of person, and if we were to attach some grade levels to it, you could see from this slide, the one thing that kids could learn in these grades that could build on each other and hopefully have them leaving their school, their academic career with some understanding on how credit cards work, how to maximize them to their advantage, and how to use them responsibly. So this is just one standard for each grade level that it applies to within the Washington K-12 standards. Any questions on any of the standards so far? Any content knowledge stuff that you guys would like to dig into more? Give you some time to reply to that while we talk about the social and emotional side of borrowing and lending, which is huge. This is an incredible place for SEL within any classroom, right? We're just looking here at this, of course, we're just looking here at the self-awareness, self-management, and self-efficacy connections. And this goes across K-12, right? For example, being or lending to an irresponsible borrower can lead to difficult emotions. It is hard for us when we lend something treasured to somebody and they mistreat it. It is hard for us when we borrow something and we don't handle it responsibly. So acknowledging those emotions, giving students coping strategies such as sentence starters or breathing techniques to help them deal with those negative emotions. Also recognizing that being a responsible borrower does reduce this idea of risk. I love the idea of introducing our students to risk a little bit younger than they generally are, right? Conflict is a risk. We have personal power over some of the conflict that we could enter into, and avoiding it or mitigating it by how we handle borrowed property. In addition, it is a great activity within, especially a younger classroom, to make a group list to collaborate on the qualities of a good borrower or the qualities of a good lender. As a group, how would you define that within the classroom, and then holding each other accountable to some of these social contracts? The other thing that we want to really make sure that people recognize, right, is that we can learn from any irresponsible borrowing that happens. It happens, but we can make efforts to rebuild trust with others. If you don't return a library book, the library doesn't ban you from entering. They don't say, no, you never get to read again, right? You can make some moves and some adjustments in your behavior to demonstrate responsibility and earn that trust back up. That connection to credit scores can be very, very powerful for our students. And so when we're looking at borrowing and lending, I would really encourage you, even with our older students, to really consider the social and emotional behaviors that this really keys into, that we adopted as children and brought into adults, and recognizing that a lot of the issues that we have related to borrowing and lending, we can start these discussions early and hopefully give students like a lot more guidance maybe than maybe some of us got. All right, that's my section. Anybody have any questions on any of that before we talk about actually implementing credit in a classroom, right? There's a lot of general knowledge here, but how do we actually talk about credit in a way that our kids can understand? My very simple way of doing it with my economy was with snack. So I worked in a district where we provided our own snacks, and I used that as an opportunity for credit. Nothing that we got was more than a quarter per unit price. It was 5th grade at the time. Unit price was in my math, so it was easy to do. We only got snacks that were quarter per package, and all snacks cost a quarter. If you didn't have a quarter, but you were hungry, you could borrow a quarter from me. You had until the end of the week to repay the quarter. If you didn't repay the quarter, you owed me 2 quarters. That, with my background and my hesitancy, I know, right? Well, with my hesitancy and my issues with credit cards, that was the best I could get, Tim. Now, Tim has taken this in a much, much better direction, and he's going to share with us part of his presentation that he gave at the Council on Economic Education's educator conference last year. He was accepted to present on this, so we're excited to hear what he has to say.
Thank you very much. You know, it's interesting as we're kind of talking about credit. You know, when it comes to work with younger children, and I've taught 3rd grade through 6th grade, and I've done it, you know, for like 40 years, and I've been doing classroom economy since probably the first year I started teaching way back in the early mid 80s. But the concept of credit and the concept of a credit system or a credit score is something that really I didn't start using until about right around COVID, a little bit before COVID. Because what I found was for students is, and it came out as anything in finance, it came out of necessity. It wasn't something I learned in a book. It was one of those things where in my classroom, I had all these kids that would turn their work in at the last possible minute to keep from getting in trouble with their parents. And so what happened is I decided I need to figure out some way of helping kids understand that turning something in late, yes, it's turned in, but there is a natural consequence to turning something in late besides turning it in on time. And so it was it was the basic concept of a credit score. And so what we did, and I'm not going to talk a lot about classroom economy today. I'll talk a little bit about it. And that's something maybe somebody wants to ask me, or maybe that's a later session we can do on classroom economies. But the idea is what I found with teaching credit and teaching financial literacy is, rather than it being a class you teach, that it's a life you live, and it's a culture. And one of the quotes I shared at this, I taught in last September in Fort Lauderdale at the financial the CEE conference, a quote that Warren Buffett said is, sometimes parents wait until kids are in their teens before talking about managing money, when they should be starting when kids are in preschool. And it really comes down to a concept of making it concrete. Most elementary kids are concrete learners. There are not very many abstract learners. It's tough to have them teach the idea of a credit score on the potential, what this is going to be, until they understand what exactly are the consequences of happening if you are a credit risk, basically, right? And so one of the things that I did in my classroom is every year, the first day of school, I come in with all my bills. I come in with my water bill. I come in with my phone bill. I come in with my electricity bill. I come in with my phone bill, and I say, hey, look, you have costs. There are costs in life, whether it be in a 3rd or 4th or a 5th grade classroom or upper grades, as it is in your parents. And so what we did is we started talking about, we came up with a list. Here are some costs. We talked about this economy. We talked about basically debits versus credits, and where you can make your money in a class and where you can spend it. Okay. And so the idea is we have a premise of safe, responsible, and respectful. And so we, as a group, we came up with this list and said, okay, let's look and see, where can you make your money and where can you spend your money? And we'll come back, and I'm not going to go into much detail more than that, because you can see from just the sign that we kind of had a conversation of just setting, again, my philosophy in elementary education was planting the seeds, so that when kids go to middle school and somebody starts talking about a credit score, they start talking about opportunity costs, they start talking about wants versus needs. It's not like, what is that? It's more like, oh, I remember Mr. Rhoades' class where I had to pay to use the bathroom, and I had to decide, do I want to do it now, or can I wait till recess when it's free? And lots of good discussions on, talking about, I don't know if it was the unintended consequence, it was more the intended consequences of how, when you have a management, and mine again was a management system, it wasn't a class. I didn't teach a class on classroom economy. It was built into the structure of the class. And so for students in my class, it's just how it was. And it wasn't a matter of thinking, what are you going to teach us today? Is this going to be, do you need a pencil? Hey, Sure. I got some pencils. There's a mush pot over there. You can help yourself. You want a pencil? It's $100. Well, I don't have a pencil. Well, there's some over there that are kind of broken. You can use one of those for now. And it's doing those kind of things. So go on to the next slide, would you, really quick? So when we started working on this, I decided way back before COVID that I wanted to teach kids the idea of being responsible. Coming out of COVID for fifth grade and for the elementary and probably the high school even worse, I'm not sure, in middle school, kids just simply showed up. And if you looked like you were there, you got credit. As a teacher during remote, it drove me absolutely bonkers to be talking to a blank screen with a person's name and no audio. For all I knew, they were, and I did know this, they were playing Minecraft. they were playing Minecraft and things, and they weren't paying attention. So I decided around COVID, let's do this. I want to teach the idea of it's nothing based on grades. It's just simply, did you turn in your work on time, late, or not at all? And the nice thing about this is I could differentiate this. If I had a student, in my school, we had 77 languages spoken other than English. And so there was a lot of cultural things we had to consider too. We had a couple kids that didn't speak any English. So anytime it was any sort of an English writing assignment, I just paid them automatically because I can't expect them to do that. So every week we would keep track of the work, and I did this on a spreadsheet, and you can see the green was on time, the fuchsia was late, and the red was not turned in. And each week, students got a paycheck. Now, in my class, the paycheck was cash. Cash is king. And I wanted, again, going back to very concrete. We did all this and worked on this, and you can see that as it was broken down, it wasn't based on who got a good score. It was because, again, the big thing for a lot of these kids was at the beginning, just show me you're there and you're breathing and you're trying, because sometimes they would just, no offense, they turn in crap. And I knew they were capable more. That's the thing. You got to be really careful with the students and what they can do. But I knew they could do more than just that, because they were so used to COVID of just showing up and turning something in. In our district, the worst you could get was 50%. Mm-hmm. To this day, it's still, nobody gets below 50%, which I understand that for participants, but I'm trying to teach the idea for the elementary, that natural consequence. So the spreadsheet was set up every day with the assignment, when it was due, what it was amount it was paid, and how much a person could get paid. And so I use this for students, when it came down to what we call the behavior remote learning and the social emotional, how do you keep kids knowing that they're actually doing the work at whatever level they are? It doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. That's not the point. I mean, student one, he might get money for an assignment that was nowhere close to the quality of something in student six. It didn't matter. They didn't know that. I knew that. And the grade book reflected that sometimes. But on this, it was just simply, were you being responsible? All right, we'll go over to the next slide.
I want to mention really quick, Tim, one point that I think is so exciting about this. I mentioned I did a classroom economy, and one part that my economy did not have was the ability to kind of restart or start over. Some of my kids got down so much in debt, they could not ever get out of it, and it affected their engagement. So that, can you talk a little bit about how often you calculate the score?
So that's a huge thing. You're right. I talked with students about in real life, your debt, your credit score, it might be 6 or 7 years. In my classroom, it's 1 week. It's week to week. So the idea is, maybe you had a bad week. Maybe something happened. Maybe you were sick, or you're absent, or whatever. The new week, next week, you start over again. One of the things that I found in my experience, most of my families don't talk about money. They don't talk about money. This is kind of a cool side story. I had a student, I went to her wedding 2 weeks ago. I had Michelle in 5th and 6th grade, right? And it just so happened the wedding was in Cabo, that helps too. But and I had her in 5th and 6th grade, and Michelle and she's now, by the way, she's like early 40s now, I think, something like that. She said, you know, Mr. Rhoades, I learned more in your class on finance than I ever did from my parents. And it wasn't like I was teaching lessons. I mean, I was. It was more that building that base knowledge, setting those, just kind of planting the seeds, and then maybe people asking about it. And it's funny because now she's come to me last week and said, hey, let's start an investment club with the teachers. I said, okay, I'll help you do that. That'd be kind of fun. Yeah, so that's kind of neat. It's come out of that, and it's building again as a teacher. That gives me goosebumps thinking you're building these lifelong skills, because school should be an extension of real life. It should not be this some subset that you have to go through just so you can go on to the next class. It needs to be something that you can engage and apply. And that's one of the things for me. It was something I worked really hard to do, was to make it something. I called it real life. Okay, so we go on the next page. So here's a credit score. So this credit score, what basically happened, and notice Paul Allen has a horrible credit score. But the point is, this credit score, I established it based on, and this would get posted every Monday morning. Every Monday morning, kids would come into class, and I had a bunch of them, not enough, but a bunch. The first thing they do is they go to the credit report. They want to see how they're going to be treated that week. Okay, because it's week to week. And so again, I'm trying to build not so much about borrowing and lending, although there are some unintended consequences that came out of that, but it's the idea of your credit score determines in life how life's going to treat you. Now, for a while, I was a landlord of a rental place, and I had to deal with all, in addition to being a teacher, I was dealing with all this real life from both sides of perspectives on being a renter and a landlord and all those kind of things. But one of the things this credit score is, every week I would take how many lessons or how many assignments was there possible. So in this one, there was 15 assignments. How many were turned in on time? Because what I found was, for a lot of kids, yeah, they get their work turned in, but they turn the very last possible minute. It's like making that minimum wage pay. They're paying the minimum amount just to get by, so they said they did it. And the credit score, and by the way, parents didn't see this. And when they came in the room, they did. Kids saw this. So I was trying to build this internal motivation again. So, and how many were turned in on time? And then I would simply take, if you see down here, assignment deduction, I had in my class, I had a perfect credit score as 800, even though it's not, because I wanted something number I could do with math. So in this is just a Google spreadsheet. I would just take this assignment deduction. I would take the number of assignments and divide it into 800. In this case, every assignment is worth 53.3 points. And I would automatically go on back on my spreadsheet, or here in the old days, you can see my little hand done it for a long time at the bottom here. I would then put in how many were turned in time. Now, progress reports would go home every week. Parents would say, hey, look at Paul Allen, you're all caught up on all your work. Way to go, Paul. Meanwhile, in class, Paul had a poor credit score. Paul was paying through the nose because Paul didn't realize that turning it in late is not as good as turning it on time. And so the idea is trying to build, it's to internalize, and I like to think of it as building a culture of financial literacy. And so the idea is, each week this would start over. We talk about it. Hey, look, this is this week. Next week starts again. So it came down to, if you look down at the difference, if you had an excellent credit score or a perfect credit score, you didn't pay anything at all. Mr. Rhoades, can I use the bathroom? Yeah, what's your credit score? It's perfect. Oh, go ahead. See you later. Go check in. Mr. Rhoades, can I use the restroom? Sure. What's your credit score? It's good. Okay, you're going to pay me $20. What if it's poor? Oh, it's 40. Now, the other thing on this you can't tell on this one, I had one level of costs for the first semester, and then I doubled it for the second semester. So it wasn't as bad as Amy's 50% charge on her snack, but it was, it was the idea of building the concept of inflation into it. And by the way, their pay went up half as much, where their costs went up twice as much. And so the idea is, this credit score, kids would look at this and they would know, okay, and I have kids all the time when it came down to elementary kids, wants versus needs. I need to use the restroom. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Now, I had some kids that would have, maybe there's bladder infections or issues like that. We would just had a little code and I didn't charge it. I'm not going to charge it. And it's every person's different, because that's people I say, well, what happens if they don't have any money? Well, that's the other question. In a second, I'll talk about it. But the idea is, they started to understand, internalize that your credit score affects what your costs are going to be. Just like we saw in those the lending of money for a homeowner. Because again, in my classroom, I had, I think, 8 languages spoken other than English in my classroom. I had a huge range of cultures, which was kind of cool, because what it did is there was different perspectives. Okay, go on to the next slide, would you?
We have a question really quick.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
When you're doing the utilities, which we saw that list on the first slide, those were the utilities that you
Yep.
had all decided on, correct? So when they're paying you, let's say a student with a poor credit score does want to use the restroom,
Yep.
they owe you $40. The question was, is it actual cash?
Yeah, so what we have
How
is,
do you give them cash?
okay, so it's an actual cash economy. And that's a great question to lead into having me teach this class later. But the idea is, matter of fact, look, I had some right here. I made my own bank of knowledge cash. And so the idea is every week when you saw that weekly, they got paid in cash. Now, the funny part about what this is in the cash, I was a stickler. If your cash was bent or ripped, or the case of kids this year, wet, it had no value. And so the idea is kids would have cash, and what they found was it led into a perfect scenario where this year I had a bunch of kids who had cash and somebody spilled water on their money. They're like, Mr. Rhoades, and I'm sorry, it's not worth anything. And so we have a lot of talk about risk analysis. What's the best? And so with their direction, we came up with a classroom savings. And I actually set it up so they got paid 1% per month, not 50 or anything, but even that's 12% interest. That's pretty high. But for elementary kids, that concept of they could put their money in the bank and they could get it out later on, and they got 1% interest per month, but it was safe from either money getting bent. I never had a problem with money getting stolen because it was an honor system, and they knew if it was stolen, we're done. We're shutting down the whole economy. But it came down to a lot of times, one student was really funny. Her family, she came from she was African American, still is, it's not was. She came from a wealthy family, but she had no money sense at all, not a single thing. She'd get money and she'd blow it on this or that. And in class, blow it on this or that would be like talking to friends or having a buddy lunch or go out to recess early. And usually by Thursday, she was broke and she started borrowing money from people. And people kind of learned if you borrow money and you loan it to Yama, she's not going to pay you back. And it was funny because, and bless her, I loved Yama because she was one of those kids who just had a smile on her face. But because she was so used to having a lot of money at home, in class, she never made that connection. So it was kind of fascinating. All right, go on to the next slide really quick. So it's a cash economy. And so you say, besides, so what's the point of spending money on just bathrooms and drinks of water? And I did school supplies too. I'd go out, and this time of the year, I'd go out and buy as many composition books as I could afford, or I'd buy glue or glue sticks or pencils. But every year, every semester, I would have what's called an auction. This was based on when I bought those chickens back in 1972, and I still taught my kids in the auction, don't be doing this. If you need to, they would learn how to do this and kind of, be really kind of careful. But they could take any money they've earned and they could bid on it, and they could buy it. This is the predecessor to eBay. And so the idea was they could take their money and all these things I just collected, their parents would donate. I do a lot of woodworking. I'd make stuff. I go to garage sales, and it was a chance for them to actually take the cash and do something with it, because there's no point to earning cash and there's no point to having cash where all the costs are negative. Nobody wants to do that. And so I had one boy a couple years ago who would buy a bunch of pencils when they were $100 because he knew after a winter break they were going to go to 200, and he sold them to classmates for 150 and cut me out of the profit because he figured out that entrepreneur spirit. Hey, I can make a profit in this. So there were some of the basics of investing. And so a lot of times in the class economy and working with that credit score, the credit score was made to build an understanding of your credit score, no matter what that is what your expenses are going to be. And in doing it at the elementary level, it starts to set some of those mindsets in place so that I like to think of as planting the seeds, so that when you get to middle school and to high school, where it's much more technical and much more directed, then yes, you have a basic understanding. Oh, I got to be careful. So I can't remember. Was there anything else I'm sharing on this? Or is that it? I think that was it.
I think that is your last slide.
Yeah. So if you
But
have some, is it now time for questions or later on?
yeah, I would say now is our question time. But I would love to start off by also saying, so Tim, you built this program over years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I would hate for anyone to look at it and think, oh, that's overwhelming. So where would you start? Where would you recommend starting? What would be the first piece if you're not ready to get into every moving piece so far? Where would you recommend just starting?
You know, the best thing to do is by far is start small. Start small. Maybe instead of having cash, maybe it's little tokens. Maybe it's little pencils. Maybe it's something. And the idea of the credit score would take some time. But and again, by the way, I've had more teachers come to me in middle school and in high school, especially special ed programs, and said, I could do this with my kids. This is perfect because it helps them understand as they're older that they can use this idea of what a credit score and how it's treated to people. In anything you do in a classroom economy or credit score, start really small and do not do anything you can't maintain. That spreadsheet is pretty cool, but it takes a huge amount of work. But what happened is, well, I just got in the habit of doing. Once you get in the habit of doing it, then the amount of work just sort of because when they get Mr. Rhoades, am I all caught up? I just say, well, go look at the spreadsheet. You don't need to ask me. You can. And so I'm trying to teach them to check for yourself and be proactive and not waiting for somebody to tell you what it is. And again, as somebody here in the thing, it's the idea of kids. They can have conversations all the time about what's the consequence from week to week. And I talked to them multiple times. In 5th grade or in 4th grade, this is a week to week thing. In real life, that credit score could change drastically, and it's going to take you years to get it back up to something. So again, it's trying to make it so it's something that's really hands-on. And do I have to do it all day? Yeah, in elementary, they have specialists, but the idea is it's something we do it's the management system. It's not a class. It's not, okay, from 11 to 12, we're going to teach credit. No, it's simply, we just do it. And then it's almost like it comes out organically. And we have some great discussions about risk and reward and wants and needs. And a big one we talked about this last year was opportunity costs. What's the opportunity cost of getting something now versus waiting and getting it later on? Maybe it'd be the bathroom, maybe it'd be buying a pencil, maybe it'd be whatever. I mean, it led to a lot of really good discussions. So in Sherry, it started over every week. So credit score and that spreadsheet was always Monday to Friday. So they always had the hope if you didn't have a good week, next week's a new week, try it again. Do it that way. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I did just launch a poll into the Zoom. Just curious, how many of us know our credit score? And maybe not specifically, but a good range of where you're at. No shame if you don't. I was just curious how many of us have checked recently, since this is the way that the conversation is kind of gravitating. Awesome. So do we have any other questions? I have some discussion starters for us, but if anyone has any other questions, please go ahead and
Amy,
type those.
I see one person asked about how you calculate the credit score. And so
Yeah.
the idea is if that one slide, I would take the number of assignments for that week.
Was it this one or the next one?
Go forward one more.
Okay.
Wait, I would take the number of assignments, which is the possible, and I would take that number and divide it into 800 because I did it as an 800. Just because it was easier. You could do an 850 to be more realistic, but 800 seemed to work. I would divide into it. And again, if you see in this sheet that I'm looking at right here, this was all basically, it was a Google spreadsheet. And the deduction, if you clicked on that link where it says 53.33, it was simply 800 divided by 15. And that's the deduction for every assignment that was not turned in on time. Because remember, this credit score, Paul Allen could have had every assignment turned in. That's not the purpose of the credit score. The purpose of the credit score is how many were turned in on time. So you can see Bill Gates is even worse than Paul Allen. Holy cats, he only had one turned in on time. So but that's how he calculated it, was using the number possible into 800. So
Tim, are people surprised when they find out that you're doing this in elementary school?
Who do you mean by people?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, the
Non-educator.
reason I say that is anybody who's known, because for me, because I've taught for such a long time, it's one of those things that people actually request because they, it's one of those things. Are they surprised? No, most of the time parents, I always just think, oh, parents will get mad at me for this. They love it. And it makes for great discussions. And we have conversations with kids at home, talk to, and, I don't know if I'm going to put the kids to the point and say, ask your parents what their credit score is. But the idea is, what's the consequences? I have lots of kids that have been homeless, that have broken families, been evicted, couldn't pay their bills, and it makes for really good discussions and saying, here, this is at an elementary level. It's not life. It imitates life, but realistically, and what I'm trying to teach the kids is you have, at the elementary level, you have control. Now, unfortunately, as we know, sometimes illness and things happen where you don't have control, but I'm not going to tell elementary kids that. I'm going to try to build the idea of you can make a decision, you can be proactive, and you can, especially at the 7, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old, so that when you get up into high school, where they start giving those, because I did the same way. I got a credit card in college because, hey, look at this. And I first went to college, the debit machine hadn't been made yet. It was just coming out like my junior year in college. And I thought, oh, this piece of plastic is magic, which was the start of a downhill fall when it came to credit. But the elementary, it's just building it as a concrete, tangible, just a life choice,
So, and I really love, I think it bears repeating what you talked about. You're using this as a management system because the load on elementary teachers, standards wise, is already so heavy. Your plate is full. You can't fit another subject in there. So you're implementing financial education in a social and emotional context through the classroom management, connecting behavior and actions and consequences for them for later. Is that a good way of saying it?
Yeah. And again, what I said before, start really, really, really small.
Mm-hmm.
Start with what you're comfortable with. And also don't feel like you have to be this expert to do it. Most of my teaching came out of necessity of what I see. It wasn't based on my own life skills, thank goodness. I mean, in some cases it was like the buying of chicken, but the idea was a lot of it came out of I saw a need with my kids. And so I just was open to saying, what can I do to help them be more engaged in learning? And the credit score for me came out of
Absolutely.
the whole COVID thing, because they
Right.
were turning in stuff that really I didn't think any business turning it in.
I mean, and it's worth mentioning that COVID and that pandemic years was for many people a massive financial trauma,
Oh yeah.
for ongoing.
Yeah.
So it's another way of kind of bringing back some of those experiences that were negative and reframing them in like a educational and more concrete and useful way, I feel like, which is really exciting. So I would love to know in the chat, as we're getting into questions, it would really help to know what kind of students do you guys serve? What kind of communities are you serving? Are there any specific student populations for which you are looking for resources? But I'd love to bring Tierra back into the conversation a little bit. Hi, Tierra. So we talked about with Tim, he's talking about trying to reinforce this idea that a credit score can get kind of changed and you can make these moves, right? Um, so for adults, right, it can be a longer process. Can you talk a little bit about how you would kind of guide somebody through that process? What are things that adults who are trying to improve their credit score might want to consider?
That's a very good question. And I just want to highlight what Tim said I was thinking about in my head is that to start small and we don't have to know everything. I think that's really important as when we're in spaces of education. But for adults, I think it's important to, you know, transparently, when I first started Take Charge, it was just to fill a need. People didn't understand credit. And I was just really frustrated with that and wanted to switch that around. And I didn't understand the impacts of financial trauma and how that relates to, being able to increase our credit score and have a good credit profile. And I learned this the hard way with one of my first clients, who was credit invisible, kind of didn't have any credit. So was able to get him up to about a 700 credit score. And almost immediately after he maxed out his credit cards, he went from having 0 credit cards to adding credit cards, per the rebuilding plan that I suggested, and just completely maxed them out, and his score went back down drastically. And so that was my learning experience of understanding the trauma around money and our money story and our money habits and how that influences our decisions. And so without addressing that, the credit education really means nothing. So I would say, one, starting with our money story. I went through an experience where at each age, I journaled about my relationship to money. So from the first time I could remember all the way until now. And that really brought out a lot of it showed the relationship that I have with money. And I think it's really important for us to start with a similar exercise like that and be able to identify some of that trauma that's there, even if we think we don't have any. Most important part. But then when it gets to the tactical part of credit, I kind of focus on three areas, but one is removing the negative accounts on your credit report. And we're able to legally do that through the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So making sure that you're something you can definitely do on your own, but really getting knowledgeable on the Fair Credit Reporting Act and how you can leverage that to clean up your credit, or just, consulting with a reputable credit company. And then the second thing is building or rebuilding, depending where you're at. So we mentioned, you can't have decent credit without having credit cards. So sometimes that's the starting point for some people. And then for others, it's reducing their credit card balances so that they have a lower credit utilization. I think those two areas are the biggest areas where someone can start alongside addressing those traumas that we might have around money.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I want to talk about credit invisibility really quick. Just based on the responses that we have some of our participants are definitely serving the communities that are affected by credit invisibility. I do have a definition here. Credit invisibility is defined as someone who is credit invisible, has no credit history, so they can't qualify for a loan or credit card. Credit invisibility disproportionately affects Black and Hispanic Americans, immigrants, and newcomers, and then younger people. And I would mention those specifically in the foster justice involved systems as well. So how can a teacher, well, yeah, just talk about credit invisibility and how it's important for us. How can we tell kids you need to have credit?
That's a really good question. And honestly, hearing, Tim's model, I think that's a great way to do it. One thing you mentioned also, Amy, is literally that compare and contrast of using debit versus credit, and highlighting, that when you're using credit, you have safety, you have more security with your credit cards. And then another thing I like to point out is the benefits from credit, that the fun benefits is what I call them. So literally I show people, I was a nomad for 18 months. So I did a lot of travel, and a lot of that came from miles and cash back from my credit cards. So choosing to use my credit card versus my debit card or cash, and that equated to X amount in additional income, that we can call it, or just rewards and benefits. So I think showing the fun side is a good place to start. And the last thing I'll say is just sharing stories. So I am 33 years old, and it was, maybe less than 10 years ago when I first learned about, how owning a home can generate equity and build wealth. So these were not conversations that I was having at home with my parents or grandparents. They weren't conversations I was having at school with my teachers, even in college. And so really just sharing those stories of, I bought my house at X amount, in 2 years, it was worth this much. And maybe, I've heard from people where they've taken out the equity in their home and they were able to start a business, or they were able to address, a huge medical situation that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford. So just sharing those types of stories in the very literal, real sense that it is, so that students can understand the benefits, versus just saying we need to have good credit, we need to have credit cards, but showing them and telling them why, even if it means going into your personal story, which I love, Tim, bringing in your bills and all of that. And also doing that in a way where students can see, okay, if I buy a home, this is how I can leverage it. Because for many Black and brown people, those are not stories that we've ever heard. So we have to hear them to be able to understand the importance of credit.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I feel like that's kind of a call to action and I love it. So kind of building off that, Tim, I feel like I kind of have Tiara's answer here. So let's say we have an educator in this audience who is like, yep, this is a great idea. I can see the power in it. I can see the value in it. But their finances are a mess, or they are drowning in credit card debt and they don't feel like they're the person to bring this to their kids. What would you say to that educator?
I've been there. I had a family and I was trying to provide the family with a single income, and I was playing credit card shell games the whole time when I was doing all my stuff working with the kids. And again, I said this before, it's not a matter of you being an expert or knowing all the answers. It comes down to is just, in my perspective, is just trying to find a way to make learning real for kids, and try to find a way where don't put yourself in this position where you are the supreme knowing everything. You're just, I always tell my students all the time, we're all students, we're all teachers. I'm the old guy, I'm the old white guy. That's what I always tell them. And the idea is that don't wait for your life to be in a perfect place to teach it, because you might teach it about year 40. And I'm not even there now, but the idea is look at what your kids get to know and I always call my students my kids. I've always done that. But what do they need and how can you impact them in that amount of time you have them to help them start to, my big thing was always to build their confidence. Like this says right here, build credit card confidence. How can I help build their confidence that you can make some decisions now as a 8 or 9 or 10-year-old, and start to think about that as an adult of what you do and how you make your choices. And so the idea is, no, you don't have to be an expert. Just simply have a desire to want to teach and help kids understand, and yourself, you'll grow with them as well. That's the cool thing about it. That you just want to help them understand a little bit more about what is this financial literacy, what are credit scores, what's credit, what's, just, I don't know. It's just, you don't have to be passionate. I'm passionate, but you have to just simply say, I want to find a way to make my learning better, I guess. That's really what it is.
I love that. Thank you. Tiara, did you want to add on to anything on that? No pressure, but
Yeah, just briefly, I think taking charge of your own situation, whether that's, figuring it out yourself, hiring someone for help so that you can feel a little bit more confident. But also, I think the best thing is what Tim said, not feeling like you have to know it all. That's because even as a credit professional for 7 years, I do not know it all. It's a system that is kept very secret for obvious reasons, which we don't need to get into. So remembering that we don't have to know it all.
We have one very specific question. Tiara, do you have a credit card recommendation for students that are graduating to start building credit?
Yes. I just responded to you, Rebecca. Sorry, that took me a while. But I would say most students would have to start off with a secured credit card, because they, probably don't have any credit built up unless they were an authorized user on their parents' or someone else's credit. So starting with a secured credit card, I would usually recommend going to their financial institution, wherever they bank at. And also knowing that even though it is a secured credit card, they're putting up the deposit to be the credit limit. They can also get denied in that way. That was my specific experience. I'm bringing the money to the credit union, but because of lack of credit and visibility, I wasn't able to get approved for a secured credit card. So another one that I recommend is Credit Card Builder, which I can share in the chat. And then I also saw Charnel on here. Sorry to call you out, but maybe if you can share some of the products at Verity Credit Union. I know that Verity and other financial institutions often have their own credit building products that would be a good fit for students graduating to build credit.
Sure, I can share. At Verity Credit Union, we have a secured card, and usually the minimum is $500. The key with secured cards is that a person still has to show that they have a monthly income that they can make the payments back on the card. So sometimes if you have a student who's transitioning off to college or something like that, and they don't have a monthly income of some sort, that can be a bit of a challenge. But you know, there's probably some potential for parents to be a co-borrower or borrower or something like that as well. So they should, whether it's Verity or any financial institution, you know, I would encourage them to talk to, you know, the place that they're comfortable with and say, here's my scenario. Aside from secured credit cards, Verity and some other lenders also have what's called a credit builder loan, and that works a little bit different. It's an installment loan rather than a credit card, and the amount of the loan is the collateral or security for the loan. And so with Verities, we hold the funds from the loan, but then each month when a person makes a payment, they get some of that money released back to them. So those are a couple ways to start. And I think that a lot of financial institutions are looking at other ways, you know, so we might see some changes in the future as well to help people start to, you know, build scores.
There is, I was just talking to Tierra about this. I was just listening to a podcast about a credit card to pay rent. Wells Fargo backed a credit card you could pay rent with, and now people are using it responsibly, which they did not anticipate. And so they're already renegotiating the terms, but just so you know, that's a consumer-friendly product right now. I want to make sure that we end on time. So I'm just going to briefly note, we're going to be linking to these. Tierra has a fantastic, I would call it like an op-ed piece in the Emerald that we are going to link to about the racial wealth gap. And if you serve students, a lot of the racial wealth gap is, you know, it's going to tie back to systemic injustices from the Jim Crow era and the need for the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and all of these things. If you have a social justice component or to your classroom, NGPF, Next Gen Personal Finance, has a fantastic mini unit on racial discrimination in finance, covers many different angles, and is very interesting. Oh, good, we got the link to the op-ed there. In addition, an article on financial trauma will also be linked, and I am putting the name of Smart Path Financial Education in the chat. I saw quite a few teachers servicing our students in special education, and this is one of the best curriculums that we have come across at FEPPP as far as providing opportunities for differentiation and diversity, equity, and inclusion ideas and instruction embedded within the lesson. So I would just encourage you, if you're looking for a specific resource, to check out SmartPath. Oh, and Tierra has been nice enough to include her information in the chat. Thank you so much. We have more coming up. Next session will be My First Loan, buying a car. So we will look specifically at sort of the process we hope a student would go through for buying a car through the perspective of a car dealer. a young man who grew up from a family of who owns a car dealership over here in Spokane. So he'll give a presentation that he shares with students, and Tierra will be here again to answer any questions you have. And with that being said, it's 5:31, so I want to make sure we're all said and done. If you have any questions specific, please stay on. We'll be happy to answer them. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you for those of you who returned after the first session. I hope you feel more confident. I hope you feel like you absolutely can bring this information in. And if you're looking for more specific ways to do that, make sure you come back. If you're interested in the getting banked and talking some of the conversations that Charnel and Tierra, we're also going to have one whole session on connecting our students and communities with financial institutions. So awesome. Thank you so much. Again, thank you to my return participants. I appreciate you, and we will see you next week, hopefully. Thank you again to Tim and Tierra, and thank you, Charnel, for stepping in with all that important information. And I hope everybody has a fantastic evening. Yay, I see someone's feeling more confident. Just one person's feeling more confident. I'm gonna call it a win. All right, thank you so much.